Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Charlotte, and it is Quarantine Storytime. Let me tilt that up a bit. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hope everyone's having a great week. I got my hair chopped yesterday, so I look a little bit less like a munchkin, like a gremlin, getting kind of shaggy. So hopefully it'll start growing out evenly. If this is your first time, welcome. We are reading War and Peace, that classic piece of literature, that classic long piece of literature. And we're a little over halfway. We're in Volume 3, Part 2, Section 18 today. So we're going to pick up and read 18, 19, and 20. And I think there's a map at some point in the middle of this section. So I will try to show you guys and hopefully explain what's going on. So let's just jump in. As you recall, we were in Moscow observing society life. And there was, everyone's patriotic fervor has kind of died down since the sovereigns left Moscow. And, everyone's back to gossiping and, carrying on about every other thing. And Pierre has sort of been dubbed Natasha's Rostov's knight because he's been so attentive to her, and especially after everything, her mini scandal, how everything went down with that. And him being there. So I think we pick back up with Moscow society. So let's just jump in. And if you need to refresh anything, remember you can always check out the War and Peace playlist on my channel with all the readings. So all right, Section 18. When Pierre returned home, he was given 2 of Rostopchin's posters that had been brought that day. The first one said that the rumor about Count Rostopchin forbidding people to leave Moscow was false, and that, on the contrary, Count Rostopchin was glad that ladies and merchants' wives were leaving. There will be less fear, less gossip, said the poster, but I answer with my life that the villain will never be in Moscow. These words showed Pierre clearly for the first time that the French would be in Moscow. The second poster said that our headquarters were in Vyazma, and that Count Wittgenstein had beaten the French, but since many of the inhabitants wished to be armed, there were weapons prepared for them in the arsenal, sabers, pistols, muskets, which the inhabitants could obtain at a low price. The tone of the poster was no longer as jocular as in Chigorin's former bantering. Pierre fell to wondering over these posters. Obviously, that dreadful storm cloud he had been calling up with all the powers of his soul, and which had at the same time aroused an involuntary terror in him, obviously that storm was approaching. Going into military service and leave for the army, or sit and wait? Pierre asked himself this question for the 100th time. He took a deck of cards that lay on his table and began to play Patience. If this Patience comes out, he said to himself, shuffling the deck, holding it in his hand and looking up, if it comes out, that means, what does it mean? But before he decided what it meant, he heard the voice of the eldest princess behind the door asking if she could come in. Then it will mean that I must go to the army, Pierre finished to himself. Come in, he added, addressing the princess. Only the eldest princess, with the long waist and stony face, was still living in Pierre's house. The 2 younger ones had married. Excuse me, mon cousin, for coming to you, she said in a reproachfully agitated voice. Something must finally be decided on. What is going to happen? Everyone has left Moscow and the people are rebellious. Why are we staying? On the contrary, everything seems quite well, ma cousine, said Pierre, with that habitual jocularity which he, always embarrassed by his role as the princess's benefactor, adopted in his relations with her. Yes, quite well, well indeed. Varvara Ivanovna told me today how our troops have distinguished themselves. It can be set down to their honor, and the people are quite rebellious. They've stopped listening. Even my maid has become rude. Soon they'll start beating us. It's impossible to walk in the street, and above all, the French will be here any day. What are we waiting for? One thing I must ask, ma cousine, said the princess. Order them to take me to Petersburg. However I may be, I cannot live under Bonaparte's rule. Enough now, ma cousine. How do you get your information? On the contrary, I will not submit to your Napoleon. Others can do as they like. If you don't want to do this, I'll do it. I'll give the order at once. The princess was clearly annoyed at the thing. But you've been incorrectly informed, said Pierre. The city's all quiet, and there isn't any danger. See what I've just read? Pierre showed the little posters to the princess. The count writes that he answers with his life that the enemy will not be in Moscow. Ah, this count of yours, the princess began with anger, is a hypocrite, a villain who set the people to rebelling himself. Didn't he write in these foolish posters that whoever it might be, just take him by the top knot and drag him to the precinct? How stupid. Anybody who gets one, they say, honor and glory to him. So much for his pretty words. Varvara Ivanovna said that the people nearly killed her for speaking French. But that's just, you take it all too much to heart, said Pierre, and he began laying out patience. Though the patients came out, Pierre did not go to the army, but remained in the deserted Moscow, still with the same anxiety, irresolution, in the fear, and at the same time the joy of waiting something terrible. The princess left towards evening the next day, and Pierre's head steward arrived with news that it was impossible to get a hold of the money needed to equip a regiment unless one of the estates was sold. In general, the head steward made it seem to Pierre that this whole undertaking with the regiment would ruin him. Pierre had a hard time concealing a smile as he listened to the steward's words. Well, Selwyn, he said, what's to be done? I can't back out of it now. The worse the state of affairs, and especially his own, the more pleasant it was for Pierre. The more obvious it was that the catastrophe he expected was approaching. By then, Pierre had almost no acquaintances left in the city. Julie was gone. Princess Maria was gone. Of close acquaintances, only the Rostovs remained, but Pierre did not call on them. That day, to distract himself, Pierre went to the village of Voronstovo to look at a big hot air balloon that was being constructed by Lipich to destroy the enemy, and the testing of the balloon, which was to go up the next day. The balloon was not ready yet, but as Pierre learned, it was being constructed at the wish of the sovereign. About this balloon, the sovereign wrote the following to Rostopchin. As soon as Lipich is ready, make him up a cockpit crew of trustworthy and intelligent men, and send a courier to General Kutuzov to inform him of it. I have told him about it. Urge Lipich, I beg you, to be very careful about where he lands for the first time, so as not to make a mistake and fall into the hands of the enemy. It is indispensable that he coordinates his movements with the general-in-chief. Returning home from Voronstovo and driving through the Boltonaya Square, Pierre saw a crowd at the execution ground, stopped and got out of the droshky. It was the flogging of a French cook accused of spying. The flogging had just ended, and the executioner was releasing from the flogging horse a fat man with red side whiskers, in blue stockings and a green jacket, who was moaning pitifully. Another criminal, thin and pale, was standing nearby. Both, judging by their faces, were Frenchmen. With a morbidly frightened air, similar to that on the thin Frenchman's face, Pierre pushed his way through the crowd. What is this? Who? For what? He asked, but the attention of the crowd, office clerks, tradesmen, shopkeepers, muzhiks, women in coats and jackets, was so eagerly concentrated on what was happening on the execution ground that nobody answered him. The fat man got up, frowning, shrugging his shoulders, and evidently wishing to show firmness, began putting on his camisole without looking around him. But his lips suddenly trembled, and he began to cry, angry with himself at as sanguine grown-up people cry. The crowd began talking loudly, to stifle their feelings of pity, as it seemed to Pierre. Some prince's cook. Well, monsieur, looks like Russian sauce is too sour for a Frenchman. Sets his teeth on edge, said a wrinkled clerk who was standing next to Pierre when the Frenchman began to cry. The clerk looked around, evidently expecting his joke to be appreciated. Some laughed, some went on, looking fearfully at the executioner, who was stripping the other man. Pierre snuffed his nose, winced, and turned around quickly, went back to the droshky, muttering to himself all the while as he walked, and got in. During the ride, he gave a start several times and cried out so loudly that the coachman asked him, "What orders?" "Where are you going?" Pierre cried out to the coachman, who was driving out to the Lubyanka. "To the commander-in-chief's, as you ordered," replied the coachman. "Fool! Brute!" cried Pierre, yelling at his coachman, which rarely happened with him. "Home, I told you, and drive quickly, blockhead. I must leave today," Pierre said to himself. At the sight of the punished Frenchman and the crowd surrounding the execution ground, Pierre had decided so definitely that he could no longer remain in Moscow and must go to the army the same day, that it seemed to him that he either told the coachman about it or the coachman should have known it himself. On returning home, Pierre told his all-knowing, all-capable coachman, Evstafievich, familiar to the whole of Moscow, that he would go to the army in Mozhaisk that night and ordered his riding horses sent there. To do everything on the same day was impossible, and therefore, to Evstafievich's mind, Pierre should postpone his departure until the next day, to leave time for the relay horses to get ahead of him. On the 24th, it cleared up after some bad weather, and that day after dinner, Pierre left Moscow. During the night, while changing horses at Perkhuskovo, Pierre learned that there had been a major battle that evening. It was said that there in Perkhuskovo, the ground shook from the cannon fire. To Pierre's question of who won, no one could give an answer. This was the battle of the 24th at Shevardino. At dawn, Pierre was riding up to Mozhaisk. All the houses in Mozhaisk were occupied by stationed troops, and at the inn where Pierre was met by his groom and coachman, there was no places in the rooms. It was all filled with officers. Everywhere in Mozhaisk and beyond Mozhaisk, troops were camped or marching. Cossacks, foot soldiers, horse soldiers, wagons, caissons, cannons could be seen on all sides. Pierre was in a hurry to move on quickly, and the further he went from Moscow and the deeper he immersed himself in that sea of troops, the more he was overcome by anxious restlessness and a new joyful feeling he had never experienced before. This was a feeling similar to what he experienced at the Slobodsky Palace at the time of the sovereign's arrival, a feeling of the need to undertake something and sacrifice something. He now experienced a pleasant sense of awareness that everything that constitutes people's happiness, the comforts of life, wealth, even life itself, is nonsense, which it is pleasant to throw away in comparison with something, with what Pierre could not account for to himself, nor could he try to clarify it to himself for whom and for what he found it so particularly delightful to sacrifice everything. He was not concerned with what he wanted to sacrifice it for, but the sacrificing itself constituted a new joyful feeling for him. On the 24th day, there was a battle at the Shevardino Redoubt. On the 25th, not a single shot was fired on either side. On the 26th came the Battle of Borodino. This is now section 19. On the 24th, there was a battle at the Shevardino Redoubt. On the 25th, not a single shot was fired on either side. On the 26th came the Battle of Borodino. Why and how was the battle offered and accepted at Shevardino and Borodino? And why was the Battle of Borodino fought? Neither the French nor for the Russians did it make the slightest sense. The most immediate result of it was, and had to be, for the Russians, that we came nearer to the destruction of Moscow, which we feared more than anything in the world, and for the French, that they came nearer to the destruction of their whole army, which they feared more than anything in the world. This result was perfectly obvious to them, and yet Napoleon offered, and Kutuzov accepted this battle. If the commanders had been guided by reasonable causes, it should have been quite clear to Napoleon that, having gone 1,300 miles and accepting battle with the likely chance of losing a quarter of his army, he was marching to certain destruction. And it should have been as clear to Kutuzov that, in accepting battle and also risking the loss of a quarter of his army, he would certainly lose Moscow. For Kutuzov, it was mathematically clear, as it was clear that, in the game of checkers, if I have one man less and keep trading man for man, I will certainly lose, and therefore I should not keep trading. When my opponent has 16 pieces and I have 14, I am only 2/8 weaker than he. But when I have traded 13 pieces, he will be 3 times stronger than I. Before the Battle of Borodino, our forces were approximately 5 to 6 with the French. But after the battle, they were 1 to 2. That is, before the battle, it was 100,000 to 120,000. But after the battle, it was 50,000 to 100,000. And yet the intelligent and experienced Kutuzov accepted the battle. And Napoleon, a commander of genius, as they called him, offered battle, losing a quarter of his army and extending his line still more. It is said that, by occupying Moscow, he thought to end the campaign as he had by occupying Vienna. There are many arguments against. Napoleon's historians themselves say that he was already wanted to stop after Smolensk, that he knew the danger of his extended position and knew that the occupation of Moscow would not be the end of the campaign, because after Smolensk, he had seen the condition of the Russian towns abandoned to him. He had not received a single response to his repeated announcements of his wish to negotiate. In offering and accepting the battle at Borodino, Kutuzov and Napoleon acted involuntarily and senselessly, and only later did historians furnish the already accomplished facts with ingenious arguments for the foresight and genius of the commanders who, of all the involuntary instruments of the world events, were the most enslaved and involuntary agents. The ancients left us examples of heroic poems in which heroes constitute the entire interest of history, and we still cannot get used to the fact that, for our human time, History of this sort has no meaning. To the other question, how the Battle of Borodino and the one that preceded it at Shevardino were offered, there exists in the same way a quite definite and universally known but completely false notion. All historians describe the matter in the following way. The Russian army in its retreat from Smolensk was supposedly seeking the best position for a general battle, and such a position was supposedly found at Borodino. The Russians supposedly fortified this position beforehand to the left of the road from Moscow to Smolensk, almost at a right angle to it, from Borodino to Utitsa, on the very place where the battle was fought. In front of this position, a fortified outpost was set up at the Shevardino Barrow, supposedly to observe the enemy. On the 24th, Napoleon supposedly attacked the outpost and took it, and on the 26th, he attacked the whole Russian army, which stood in position on the field of Borodino. So say the histories say, and it's all completely incorrect, as anyone who wishes to get the essence of the matter can easily satisfy himself. The Russians were not seeking the best position. On the contrary, during their retreat, they passed many positions that were better than Borodino. They did not stop at any of these positions because Kutuzov did not want to accept a position that he had not chosen, because the people's call for battle had not yet expressed itself strongly enough, and because Miloradovich had not yet arrived with the militia, and for countless other reasons. The fact is that the former positions were stronger, and the position at Borodino, the one on which the battle was fought, not only was not strong, but could no more be considered a position than any other place in the Russian Empire on which, by guesswork, one might randomly stick a pin in the map. The Russians not only did not fortify the position on the field of Borodino to the left, at a right angle to the road, that is the place where the battle was fought, but never thought, until the 25th of August, 1812, that the battle could be fought in that place. This is proved first by the fact that there are not only no fortifications in that place on the 25th, but that, having been begun on the 25th, they were not finished on the 26th. Secondly, it is proved by the position of the Shevardino redoubt. The Shevardino redoubt, in front of a position on which the battle was accepted, made no sense at all. Why was this redoubt fortified more than any other point, and why, in defending it until late at night on the 24th, were all efforts exhausted and 6,000 men lost? A mounted Cossack patrol would have sufficed to observe the enemy. The third proof that the position on which the battle took place had not been foreseen, and that the Shevardino redoubt was not an outpost of that position, is that until the 25th, Barclay de Tolly and Bagration were convinced that the Shevardino redoubt was the left flank of the position, and that Kutuzov himself, in his report written hot on the heels of the battle, called Shevardino the left flank of the position. Much later, when there was more leisure for writing reports about the Battle of Borodino, the incorrect and strange testimony was invented, probably to justify the mistakes of the commander-in-chief, who must be infallible, that the Shevardino redoubt was supposedly an outpost, whereas it was only a fortified point on the left flank, and that the Battle of Borodino was accepted by us at a fortified and previously chosen point, whereas it occupied in a completely unexpected and almost unfortified place. Whereas it occurred in a completely unexpected and almost unfortified place. This is evidently how it was. A position was chosen along the river Kolocha, which crossed the high road not at a right angle, but at an acute angle, so that the left flank was in Shevardino, and the right near the village of Novo, and the center in Borodino, by the confluence of the rivers Kolocha and Voina. From an army that aims at stopping the enemy from moving down the Smolensk road towards Moscow, this position, under the cover of the river Kolocha, is obvious to anyone who looks over the field of Borodino, forgetting how the battle took place. Napoleon, having ridden to Valuvo on the 24th, did not see, as the history books say, the position of the Russians from Utitsa to Borodino. He could not have seen the position because it did not exist, and did not see the outposts of the Russian army, but ran into the Shevardino redoubt as he pursued the Russian rearguard, and, unexpectedly for the Russians, had his troops cross the Kolocha. And the Russians, even before the general battle, withdrew their left wing from the position they had intended to occupy, and took up a new position that had not been foreseen or fortified. By crossing to the left side of the Kolocha, to the left side of the road, Napoleon shifted the whole future battle from right to left, viewed from the Russian side, and transferred it to the field between Utitsa, Semyonovsko, and Borodino, a field no more advantageous as a position than any other field in Russia, and the whole battle of the 26th took place on that field. In a crude form, the plan of the supposed battle and the actual battle is in the map opposite. So I don't know if you guys can see this. Let's see. That'll probably be backwards, but we have, this looks like the, these are the Russian forces, this line right here. And this is them on the 24th, and then they fell back some on the 26th. And this is the French forces on the 24th, but then how they move down here more this way on the 26th. So from going like this and like this, everybody kind of shifted around this way. And then we have, this is the river running through, this is the Voyna, this is the Kolocha, this is the Voyna here. And this is the Smolensk-Moscow road. So instead of coming at the road and hitting the river, with the Russian being able to use the river as a, there's the river, with the Russian forces being able to use the river against the French, they skirted around it. So then they skirted around it, and then now we're coming up this way. And the battle here and the battle here happened rather than perhaps a slightly more fortified place. Hopefully that kind of makes sense to some of you guys. Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's a little bit like Dorothy Hamill here. We're really short haircut. But yeah, hopefully it'll grow out evenly. It looks pretty cool when I slick it all the way back. It's like kind of slick. It's a little like Trinity via the Matrix. But otherwise, we got like a Julie Andrews, Dorothy Hamill thing going on, which, you know, I'm mad at. Anyways, so hopefully you guys kind of could see some of that. It's a little bit tricky to, but yeah, kind of get an idea. They kind of move themselves around. Their description helps with the map. If Napoleon, so carrying on, if Napoleon had not ridden out to the Kolocha on the evening of the 24th and had not ordered an attack on the redoubt that same evening, but had begun the attack the next morning, no one would have questioned that the Shevardino redoubt was the left flank of our position, and that the battle would have taken place as we had expected. In that case, we would probably have defended the Shevardino redoubt on our left flank still more tenaciously. We would have attacked Napoleon in the center or on the right, and the general battle would have taken place on the 24th at a position that had been fortified and foreseen. But since the attack on our left flank took place in the evening, following the retreat of our rear guard, that is, immediately after the Battle of Gridnevo, and since the Russian commanders did not want or did not manage to begin the general battle that same evening of the 24th, the first and main action of the Battle of Borodino was already lost on the 24th, and obviously led to the loss of the one fought on the 26th. After the loss of the Shevardino redoubt, we found ourselves in the morning of the 25th with no position on the left flank, and were forced into the necessity of pulling our left wing back and hastily fortifying it wherever it ended up. But it was not just the Russian troops on the 26th of August it's not just that the Russian troops on the 26th of August were defended by weak, unfinished fortifications. The disadvantage of this position was increased still more by the fact that the Russian commanders, not having fully grasped the accomplished fact, the loss of the position on the left flank and the transfer of the whole future battlefield from right to left, remained in their extended position from the village of Novo to Utitsa, and as a result had to move their troops from right to left during the battle. Thus, throughout the battle, the Russians confronted the whole French army, directed against our left wing, with forces that were twice weaker. The actions of Poniatowski against Utitsa and of Ovarov against the French on the right flank were separate from the main course of the battle's action. And so the Battle of Borodino took place not at all as described in an attempt to conceal the mistakes of our commanders and thereby diminishing the glory of the Russian army and people. The Battle of Borodino did not take place on a chosen and fortified position, with only slightly weaker forces on the Russian side, but owing to the loss of the Shevardino redoubt, was accepted by the Russians on open, almost unfortified terrain with forces twice weaker than the French. That is, in conditions in which it was not only unthinkable to fight for 10 hours and leave the battle undecided, but unthinkable to keep the army for as long as 3 hours from total destruction and flight. Section 20. On the morning of the 25th, Pierre was driving out of Mozhaisk, going down the huge, steep, and crooked hill that led out of town past the cathedral that stood on the hill to the right, in which a service was going on and the bells were ringing. Pierre got out of the carriage and went on foot. Behind him, some mounted regiment was coming down the hill with singers at its head. In the opposite direction came a train of carts with men wounded in yesterday's action. The peasant drivers, shouting at the horses and whipping them with knots, kept riding from one side to the other. The carts with 3 or 4 wounded men lying or sitting in them bounced up and down on the stones scattered over the steep ascent in the guise of pavement. The wounded men, bandaged with rags, pale, with compressed lips and frowning brows, clinging to the sides, bounced and jostled in the carts. They all looked at Pierre's white hat and green tailcoat with almost naive, childlike curiosity. Pierre's coachman shouted angrily at the train of wounded that they should keep to one side. The cavalry regiment, coming down the hill with songs, ran into Pierre's droshky and blocked the road. Pierre stopped, pressing himself to the edge of the road, which was dug out of the hillside. Because of the slope of the hill, the sun did not reach the dugout road, and it was cold and damp. Over Pierre's head was the bright August morning, and the bells ringing out merrily. One cart with wounded stopped on the edge of the road just next to Pierre. The driver, in bast shoes, ran breathlessly to the cart, stuck a stone under the tireless rear wheels, and began to straighten the breeching as he stopped his little horse. One wounded old soldier with his arm in a sling, who had been walking behind the cart, took hold of it with his good arm and glanced at Pierre. "Well, countrymen, are they setting us down here or taking us to Moscow?" he said. Pierre was so deep in thought that he did not hear the question. He looked first at the cavalry regiment that had now run into the train of wounded, then at the cart he was standing near, and on which 2 wounded men were sitting and one was lying, and it seemed to him that there, in them, lay the solution to the problem that preoccupied him. One of the soldiers sitting on the cart had probably been wounded in the cheek. His whole head was bound in rags, and one cheek was swollen as big as a baby's head. His mouth and nose were askew. The soldier looked at the cathedral and crossing himself. The second, a young boy, a recruit, fair-haired and as white as though there were no blood at all in his delicate face, looked at Pierre with a fixed, kindly smile. The third lay prone, and his face he could not see. The cavalry singers were just passing by the cart. "Ah, lost and gone, this bristly head, now living in some foreign land." They poured out a soldier's dance song. As if seconding them, but with another sort of merriment, the metallic ringing of the bells throbbed on high. And with yet another sort of merriment, the sun's hot rays bathed the top of the slope opposite. But under the slope, by the cart with the wounded men, near the panting little horse, where Pierre was standing, it was damp, bleak, and sad. The soldier with the swollen cheek looked angrily at the cavalry singers. "Some songbirds," he said reproachfully. "Today it wasn't just soldiers. I saw peasants, too. They even drive peasants to it," a soldier standing behind a cart said with a sad smile, addressing Pierre. "No sorting them out nowadays. They want the whole people to throw their weight into it. Moscow, in short. They want to make an end of it." Despite the vagueness of the soldier's words, Pierre understood everything he meant to say and nodded approvingly. The road cleared, and Pierre went down the hill and drove on. Pierre drove along, looking on both sides of the road, searching for familiar faces, and everywhere meeting only the unfamiliar military faces of various kinds of troops, who stared with identical surprise at his white hat and green tailcoat. Having gone about 3 miles, he met a first acquaintance and joyfully addressed him. This acquaintance was one of the chief doctors of the army. He was coming towards Pierre in a britska, with a young doctor sitting beside him, and recognizing Pierre, told his Cossack, who sat on the box in the place of a coachman, to stop. "Count, your excellency, what are you doing here?" asked the doctor. "I just wanted to have a look." Yes, there's plenty to look at." Pierre got out and stopped to talk with the doctor, explaining to him his intention of taking part in the battle. The doctor advised, Bezukov to address himself directly to his serenity. Why should you be God knows where in obscurity during the battle? He said, exchanging glances with his young colleague. And his serenity does know you after all, and would receive you graciously. That's the thing to do, old boy, said the doctor. The doctor seemed tired and hurried. You think so? And I also wanted to ask you, where is the actual position? Asked Pierre. Position, said the doctor. That's not in my line. Go past Tatarinovo, where all the digging's going on. Climb up on the barrow there. You can see from there, said the doctor. You can see from there, and if you... But the doctor interrupted him and moved towards the Britska. I'd take you there, but by God, you see, the doctor gestured at his throat. I'm racing to the corps commander. How are things with us? You don't count tomorrow's the battle. For 100,000 troops, we must figure on at least 20,000 wounded, and we don't have enough stretchers or beds or medics or doctors for even 6,000. There are 10,000 carts, but we need other things as well, so do as you like. The strange notion that among all these thousands of men, alive, healthy, young and old, who had stared with merry surprise at his hat, there was probably 20,000 destined for wounds and death, maybe the same ones he had seen, struck Pierre. They may die tomorrow. How can they think of anything else but death? And suddenly, by some mysterious linking of thoughts, he vividly pictured the descent of the hill of Mozhaisk, the carts with the wounded, the ringing bells, the slanting rays of the sun, and the songs of the cavalrymen. The cavalrymen go to battle and meet the wounded, and they don't stop to reflect for a moment on what awaits them, but go past and wink at the wounded. And 20,000 of them are doomed to die, yet they get surprised at my hat. Strange, thought Pierre, heading on towards Tatarinovo. By a landowner's house on the left side of the road stood carriages, wagons, crowds of orderlies and sentries. His serenity was staying there. But at the time of Pierre's arrival, he was not there. There was almost no one from his staff. They were all at a prayer service. Pierre rode on to Gorky. Driving up a hill and coming to a small village street, Pierre saw Muzhik militiamen for the first time, with crosses on their hats and white shirts, who, with loud talk and laughter, lively and sweaty, were doing some sort of work to the right of the road on an enormous barrow overgrown with grass. Some of them were digging at the hill with shovels, others were transporting dirt over planks and handcarts. Still others stood around doing nothing. 2 officers were standing on the barrow, giving them orders. Seeing these Muzhiks, who obviously still enjoyed their new military situation, Pierre began to recall the wounded soldiers in Muzhaisk and understood what the soldier had meant to express, saying, they want the whole people to throw their weight into it. The sight of these bearded Muzhiks working on the battlefield with their strange, clumsy boots, with their sweaty necks, and some with their side-buttoned shirts open, revealing their sunburned collarbones, impressed Pierre still more strongly than anything he had seen or heard so far about the solemnity and significance of the present moment. And we'll stop it there for today. And thank you all for tuning in today. It just, interesting that the reflection, of when you're in a thick of things and how it seems. And I love Tolstoy, how he keeps calling out everyone, like, they said things were like this, but they were really like this, and historians painted it this way, and everyone's trying to make sense of the fact that things are just, go crazy. And I think it's pretty hilarious how he's always like, yeah, it wasn't as planned and orchestrated as everyone says. You tell him, boy. But anyways, and our man Pierre, he's got a good heart, but this man just needs to pick something and do it. I feel like he just lolls about waiting for the right thing. But I mean, maybe we all do that to some extent. So anyways, we will see what happens with the battle tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody. And yes, thank you for the comments on the haircut. And hope you all have a lovely day. And take care.